John was enjoying a welcome mid-morning break when he was the victim of a vicious street crime. It cost him several £1,000s, but it wasn't until the next day he realised the enormity of it. All he can recall is responding to a text from what he thought was his bank, urgently asking him to verify his security details. Moments later, he'd been robbed in broad daylight.
You can't see cybercrime, but there are ways to avoid it. At Barclays, we'll never ask you to verify your security details by text.
Quite sure we can get that from them, though. Let's talk to Peter Hitchens from the Mail on Sunday. Peter, very good morning to you.
Good morning.
I don't know whether you have a view on the Parole Board and how it operates, but like many of the things that you write about, it doesn't quite seem to do its job terribly well.
Well, I think there obviously has to be cases for parole on occasion, and there are undoubtedly people who, after a while, should be let out. But I think the problem with people such as Pitchfork is that this is a man convicted beyond any reasonable doubt of serious murders. And there has been for some time, I don't know, I haven't checked lately, but it used to be one of the most fascinating figures in British criminology that every 3 years, 2 people in this country were killed by convicted murderers who'd been released on parole. It's one of my arguments. I mean, I don't support the reintroduction of the death penalty at the moment because I don't think that our judges are of high enough quality, and I think our juries aren't independent enough. But there are some cases, and the Pitchfork case seems to be one of them, where it seems to be very, very hard for anyone seriously to argue that the death penalty would not have been justified. And I just, unless you're an actual pacifist and don't ever believe that society can defend itself against violence with violence, then I think you have to concede that. And part of my point about the released murderers killing people was this: people always say, well, you can't risk executing an innocent person. So indeed, you shouldn't execute innocent people. You should take endless steps to prevent yourself from doing that. But you can't make that a bar to a policy which is otherwise effective and useful. Because if you did, then, for instance, you could not release any convicted killers at all, ever. And sometimes there presumably are cases for doing that. I'm not. People think I'm a hanger and flogger, but I'm not actually in favour of very long prison sentences. I've visited prisons. They're terrible places, and particularly now that they're run by the inmates, they're far, far worse than they used to be. And most of us, if we were put in one of them, couldn't survive. We'd go crazy after 10 years. And I don't believe in long prison sentences for their own sake, which is one of the reasons why I think the death penalty for heinous murder is on occasion justified. This seems to me to be one of those occasions, in which case parole wouldn't really arise, would it?
Well, it wouldn't. I mean, I'm like you. I'm a bit squeamish about the death penalty, partly because I don't have great confidence in the system that would operate efficiently and correctly in every single case. But I do think that there are certainly cases where people who have committed certain types of crime should never be released on the basis that they will never be safe to be released. And if you are asking about whether it makes the world a safer place to lock up murderers and rapists, well, I think it does, because they're clearly not out there murdering and raping. And so I think that's a pretty straightforward case.
But there's also a very powerful deterrent effect, not against murder as such, but against the use of violence by criminals. A fascinating fact is that the numbers, again, I don't have them to hand, so I wasn't expecting to discuss this, but the numbers of attempted murders and serious woundings with intent are rising greatly. Now, if these crimes, which often involve terrible injuries to the victim, had happened in the early 1960s or 1950s, almost all the victims would have died, which would mean that if we had the homicide, if we had the medical facilities of 1950 and 1960, huge numbers of people would now be dying after being attacked, and our homicide and murder figures would be immensely higher than they are. And this is concealed by the brilliance of trauma surgeons and health service and paramedics in saving the lives of their victims in thousands of cases a year. So we are actually concealing from ourselves a very great rise in the amount of savage violence in our streets, which is followed I can't prove that it's the cause, but it's certainly followed the end of the death penalty. And also, of course, the carrying of lethal weapons by criminals has immensely increased since the death penalty was ended. So it's always been the powerful deterrent effect of it that seemed to me to be worth at least studying. But one has to divorce the argument about the death penalty from the emotionalism which also surrounds it from both sides to have a rational debate on it. In this case, I look at the Pitchfork case. I think, what on earth is the point of not executing this person, given what we know him to have done?
Yes. No, I think that's a very good argument, and I think many people would agree with it. Let's talk a bit about your piece at the weekend on the border force, because it is single-handedly now becoming the biggest issue, I think, facing this government and this country. David Davis wrote a thread at the weekend about why he thought sending migrants to a sort of offshore registration centre would be the wrong idea, because he made out that actually in Australia, when they did it, it ended up costing more money per migrant than it would have done to actually house them in this country. And I said to him, the problem for the Tory party is that they must get to grips with this before it either destroys either the government and or the country.
Well, I don't know whether they can. I first wrote about this on a large scale. I looked it up the other day in January of 2019, and I was at that time pretty confident that we could have adopted this simple method of towing them back to France and saying to the French, we don't want them. And after a few weeks or indeed a few months of doing that, I think the message would have sunk home. But that might have been possible at the time when it was still really tiny. And what I was pointing out was that a huge psychological barrier had been broken. No one had realized until 2019 or 2018 that you could actually get across the Channel so easily. The people smugglers hadn't realized it because they thought of the Channel as a difficult obstacle to cross. And once people stopped being afraid of it, there's no limit to how many people could come across. And we have had days in recent months, in recent weeks, when the official total of people who've got into the country by coming across the Channel has been more than 1,000 a day. And that, of course, doesn't count however many there are who are undoubtedly slipping in without being recorded by anybody. And the Border Force knows this and knows that they're doing so because they've probably got good reason not to be in any way registered. But we don't know how many. But if this is sustained at this rate for a year, then you have the population of a town the size of Brighton coming into the country every year. Whoever they are and whatever their motives are and whatever their reasons are for coming here, that is a major social and economic problem for the country. Yeah. And one which you can't ignore. If there ever was an opportunity to take them back, it's plainly gone. The French won't accept it, and it would involve a terrible and probably disastrous standoff in the Channel. The Australian solution of putting them in a third country doesn't seem to be available to us, and we're constantly rumoured that Albania is going to take them.
I don't know why they keep coming up with this rubbish.
I don't know. We simply haven't got this the amount of sea between us and our nearest neighbour that Australia has, nor have we got countries which are willing to do this for us. I don't know. I'm beginning to wonder whether this is in fact insoluble. And of course there is the other aspect of it which I never cease to harp on about because it is so important. None of this would have happened had it not been for the stupid policies of Anthony Blair and of David Cameron. Blair in destroying the stability of the Middle East with his Iraq war, and Cameron in destroying the Gaddafi regime in Libya, which was, as a lot of people knew at the time, and as Gaddafi played one of the main barricades to mass migration from the North African coastline to Europe. Both of those things were catastrophic, and we now find out all those who thought it was just a matter of theory as to whether we should do these stupid things or not, now find out that it's a matter of practice. I don't see how, given modern diplomacy and everything else, that we can actually do much about it. But it certainly is not helped by the fact that there is probably nobody in the higher reaches of the civil service or politics who really believes that borders are worth defending.
Well, I think that's part of the problem from the European Union, isn't it? But I know that way back when Schengen was being sort of put together, there were 3 countries that opted out of the freedom of movement scenario, which meant that actually anybody could come in any way, shape or form. It was Ireland, the UK and Sweden. And those 3 countries decided that they would want more immigration than every other European country. And that's part of the problem as well, because it's never really been changed, that basic policy. And so because you can now, I mean, I spoke to a guy in the summer when we were talking about coronavirus restrictions, and he decided upon himself to drive to Greece. And he got in his car, put his car on the train, went to Calais. Nobody stopped him at Calais. He drove literally to Brindisi, I think it was, in Italy. And the first time he was asked for his passport was when he got off the ferry in Greece. At no point was he stopped anywhere. And I think that's a problem.
Until recently, I mean, when the migration across the Mediterranean became very widespread, France and Italy, for instance, began to enforce their borders, and so did some of the other Schengen lands. But I've travelled from vast distances across Europe without being asked for a passport. And you can walk from one country to another. And I've walked from Germany to France and from Germany to the Netherlands without, as if it were from one town to another without any check. That's the state of affairs over there. And therefore, once you're into the European Union, you can, without very much difficulty, find your way to the Channel. And there it is. Good. Not all of them come here. A lot of them want to come to Germany as well. But there are particular reasons why so many people want to come here. And I'll say it again. I don't blame them for wanting to come any more than I blame people for wanting to afford bigger houses than they have, or have better jobs than they have. People should have aspirations, but there are barriers to these things from happening. And what the people smugglers are doing is they're trying to bypass those barriers and jump the queues and prevent people from doing the thing lawfully and properly. If you are going to have, I'm not sure at the moment how much immigration we need. I think less than we get by some way. But you should, I think, be able to choose who you let in and who you don't. Yeah. And you can't do that under this procedure.
Yes, and you should also be able to throw people out if they do not qualify, as per the man in Liverpool, who was denied applications after applications from as long ago as 2014, and yet he was still living here.
Oh, it was my old friend Richard Littlejohn keeps pointing out. You should remember that the hijack of the Afghan plane, which arrived, I think, at years ago, and he said at the time, and I remember thinking the same thing. I'll bet you that everybody involved in this is still here 20 years hence, and this is incredibly difficult to remove people from this country. Not least because the countries from which they came are not, in many cases, particularly anxious to have them back. So they're not going to make the effort. It's also very expensive. I think we've with the mixture of open borders idealism and stupid wars, we may have done for Europe as it was. I think it actually may be over. It's just a matter of time as to when that actually happens.
Yeah.
It is extraordinary how once you have totally free movement of people, it changes the world.
Yeah, it totally does.
So it changed the United States too. I think hugely. The United States is now increasingly a bilingual country, English and Spanish, which it used not to be.
Well, I remember when I lived in the US, as you probably might remember, there was a Time magazine cover that said that by 2040, Spanish would actually be the main language of the US of A. But stay with us, Peter, for a moment. We're just going to take a little short break. We'll come back. We want to talk about the Europe.
2nd of November.
This is Talk Radio.
Across the UK, online, on DAB+, and on the Talk Radio app.
The Independent Republic of Mike Graham on Talk Radio.
Welcome back to the Independent Republic of Mike Graham right here on Talk Radio. We're talking to Peter Hitchens from the Mail on Sunday. Peter, I think the other problem that exists out there is, as you've pointed out, because of this kind of Blair-inspired wokery, for want of a better word, we have all these institutions now who do not do what it says on the tin. Like you said, the Church of England with people in there who don't really believe in God, Border Force that don't really believe in borders, police that don't really want to arrest people for any crime, doctors who don't want to see anybody in case they're not very well. Where has all this kind of madness come from?
Well, it's come from many different places, but a lot of it's come from the huge political and social revolution of the 1960s, which has now pretty much come to completion. In that the people who went to university with me in the late 1960s and early 1970s have risen to the top in almost all the major professions and activities in our society, in politics and in the law as well, particularly. And not only have they risen to the top, but those who've come behind them have followed the same politics. And what people think that a revolution is going to involve barricades in the streets and people running about with bayonets. It doesn't anymore. It just involves a quiet takeover of our lives and the way things are done. And what you can, people say, well, maybe there'll be a censor in every newspaper office. There doesn't need to be a censor in a newspaper office or a TV studio these days, or indeed in a workplace, does there? Because people are scared stiff of saying anything which might not fit in with the new ideologies. So it's happened. You're living in a country which has undergone at least as big a revolution as Russia underwent in 1917, but which doesn't even realize it. It's the old Chinese executioner story, isn't it? You know, the story of the Chinese executioner who was famed for his amazing skill at execution, came to this town, executed when this criminal was brought before him to be executed, and the executioner made a few flourishing passes with his sword, and the condemned man said after a while, well, I'm sick of all this, it's very boring, I'm supposed to be such a brilliant executioner, would you please get on with it? And the executioner said, kindly nod, please. And the man's head fell off, because the execution had already been accomplished. Our revolution has happened without us being aware of it. All the buildings are still standing. A lot of the symbols are still up. We've still got a queen. As I say, she's been so completely taken over by the modern doctrine that she might as well not be there. So it's incredibly clever to have a revolution which nobody notices. Then you can get on with doing what you want. And in between, you can have elections in which you can pretend to be concerned. Education, education, education. After which, education gets worse. Tough on the causes of crime, tough on crime. After which, there's more crime and more cause for it, I might say. And then constant claims by Home Secretaries of both parties they've got immigration under control, which they have not got. But underneath, and here's this thing which I do come back to in this discussion, this extraordinary article written by Michael Andrew Neather, Neather, in the Evening Standard a few years ago, in which he admitted that he was a former New Labour apparatchik, but he discovered a driving purpose in the immigration policy of the Blair government to change the country. And to marginalise conservatism, and that's what they did. And when I was a revolutionary, we were in favour of immigration, not because we particularly liked immigrants, we never think against them, but because we didn't like the way Britain was at the time, and we saw large-scale immigration as a way of changing our society.
And I mean, I don't think anybody could say now with any doubt that it has changed society massively, particularly in the last 10 to 15 years. But interestingly, just before we let you go, a piece sort of popped up on Twitter at the weekend, I'm not quite sure how, of something that you and I had talked about last December, where you were sort of basically saying if people don't stand up to this madness, you know, it's just going to get worse. And it was quite prescient. Yes. It got another sort of 40,000 views over the weekend. Interesting times that we live in, because
I had to point out on Twitter how old it was.
Yeah.
And may I point out they didn't stand up.
No.
So we are. I mean, my view. I feel like the leader of a defeated party at a general election. We tried as far as we could. We did everything we could. We offered all the warnings that were available, and nobody paid any attention. Well, now you've got what you asked for, and I'm sorry to say that I told you so. And I've many times said to you, saying I told you so is my principal pleasure in life. So I shall go out now into the street with a smile on my face.
But I mean, I guess the one thing that you could say, if you were looking for some glint of light at the end of the tunnel, is that at least we're not living in Austria.
Well, no, we're not. But then never were we? Look at the history and traditions of Austria are not like ours. It's a country where governments naturally it's history, the Austro-Hungarian Empire, the dreadful bureaucracy and stolidity of the Habsburgs, and then the terrible period between the wars. It's not a country with a happy history of liberty under the law, is it?
No,
unlike us,
right? It really isn't, and I guess that's what tells us that we must not be like some of the countries in Europe, the way they were, the way they are now. Peter, good to talk to you. Thank you very much indeed. Thanks. Peter Hitchens, there from the Mail on Sunday, making a great deal of sense. He always did.